Hey everyone, Coach Micah here. Welcome back to the channel. Today is Theory Thursday, which means we will be taking a look at a specific part of debate theory. Now, for the future Theory Thursdays, we might look at some speeches, we might look at some limited prep, or any other type of helpful information to help you in your events. But I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to stick with debate theory, especially because we're getting closer to NITOC. This resolution has a lot of fun twists and turns, and we still have another resolution after that. So stay tuned for those videos. We will be continuing Mars Hill Mondays, and I'm trying to figure out other short form video series I can create during the week to give you as much content as possible leading up to the national tournament. But for now, we are going to be focusing on today's episode of Theory Thursday. What makes a good value? On today's episode of Theory Thursday, we're going to be diving headfirst into the values debate. After all, it is the key aspect and the thing that makes Lincoln Douglas values debate unique from other forms of debate. And not all values are equal. Some of them are better than others, and this video will show you why that is the case. I'll show you the different types of values there are, and of course, how we can uphold the value. But of course, I need to show you a quick agenda. What are we actually going to be looking at in today's round? Our first point is that we're going to talk about what a value actually is. Next, I'm going to show you what makes a good value. We'll talk about the different kinds of values that we see in Lincoln Douglas. Then I want to discuss the criterion, why that is important, where it comes from, what exactly does it do. And of course, I want to go over some recent values that I saw at the tournament for the resolution incrementalism is superior to radicalism. And we'll look over them, and I'll show you whether or not they were good, why they were good, and maybe how we can improve them if you wanted to use a value similar. But without further ado, let's get into our first point. What exactly is a value? Simply put, a value is an external measure for the resolution. It's the standard that we use to apply the subjects of the resolution to. Now, what do I mean by subjects? Well, there are two different types of values resolutions, right? Two different types of LD resolutions. You have a bright line resolution. For example, the resolution that was debated when I first did LD was preemptive warfare is morally justified. And you'll notice that there's only one subject that we are comparing to the measure, preemptive warfare. We're saying that that thing is morally justified. This is called a bright line because we're only talking about one subject, and we're applying it to that to the value to see if it meets that standard. However, in a comparative resolution, such as the one we're debating now, incrementalism is superior to radicalism as a means to achieve social change, we have two different subjects, incrementalism and radicalism, and we use the value as a weighing mechanism to apply them both to see which one actually achieves that value. The question is, when do we need a value? Well, when you see phrases in the resolution like better than, superior to, justified over, justified more, more, good, and anything that where you see more this or more that, is preferred to, ought to be, should be, prioritized over. These are all things that show that you need to prove something is better than something else, and that's where the value comes in. It's also what makes Lincoln Douglas values debate different from other forms of debate, because you have to determine why something is better. It doesn't start out as objective, it's actually quite subjective. Things like better than, superior to, ought to be. You have to create a persuasive argument to show why those are the case. They're not just an objective measure. But the value is the objective measure. It's the measure that you put into the round to help the judge reach that conclusion. So it's the weighing mechanism that the judge will use to compare the arguments and make their vote. I also want to point out very quickly, values have a moral charge. It's another reason why they're different from other forms of debate. Because LD is inherently an ethics or philosophical debate, the majority of the topics include some sort of moral charge, some sort of subjective feeling or subjective measure. And when I say moral charge, what I mean is when we say ought to do something, there's a reason why we ought to do something. And the moral charges don't have to be really strong. They can actually be pretty small. But when it comes to subjectivity, that's what I mean. And because it's an ethics debate, we're talking about the goodness or badness of an action. And goodness or badness is a moral thing. Now, when we look at this moral charge, it's also the reason why we have what's called a value link, or a reason to prefer, or a justification. It's that extra line of logic that tells the judge that for this round, my value works the best because it does XYZ, or because it applies to XYZ. Basically, because it is the best measure for the round. I'm showing you, Judge, we need to use my weighing mechanism because it gives us the best understanding of the resolution. So now that we know what a value is, we can be looking at what makes a good value. Because it's a weighing mechanism, the value is like a scale, and it needs to be neutral and, of course, applicable to the resolution. And we determine these by 3 different criteria, or the things that make a good value a good value. These things have to be met in order for it to be considered a good value. The first thing is that a value needs to be external. In other words, it needs to be outside of the resolution. For example, if the resolution is preemptive warfare is morally justified because it is morally justified, that doesn't make sense. We actually need a standard that proves why it's morally justified, and so we use an external measure. The second quality of a really good value is that it is measurable. The judge should be able to tell when your value has been met. For example, if you have the value of life, we can see that your side of the resolution upholds life either by saving lives or by making lives better. Same thing with prosperity, that can be measured economically, it can be measured with freedom, things like that. But if you had a value such as destiny or truth, it's so much harder to prove that you've actually upheld those values because they're so incredibly vague. So values need to be external and they need to be measurable. The third quality of a good value is that it is specific, meaning it's actually relevant to the topic today. For example, if we take our resolution, which talks about the metrics of social change, right? Incrementalism or radicalism, we wouldn't use a value of entertainment because entertainment doesn't really make sense given the context of the situation we're talking about here. Instead, we might use a value like human dignity or human life. Basically, values have to actually be relevant to the context of the conversation and the debate that we're having. So to recap, values need to be external, they need to be outside of the resolution, or else you're going to have circular logic. They need to be measurable. I need to be able to see whether or not the value has been met, whether or not my side of the resolution actually achieves the value. And of course, it needs to be specific. It needs to be relevant to our topic. There are also different kinds of values. There's actually 3 of them that you will see out in the real world, with one of them being much more rare, and we'll explain why in a second. Of course, you have what's called a counter value. This is when the affirmative starts the round by bringing up their value. The negative decides that that value actually isn't a good weighing mechanism for the round and presents their counter value. Of course, with a reason as to why their value is better than the opponent's, refuting the opponent's value. You have a buffer value, or some people call it or know it as a super value. It's the idea that it is a broader type of value, it's less measurable. And the reason that you have a buffer value is because you're trying to include so many different types of measurements. If a measurement is met over here, then it achieves the buffer value. If a measurement is met over here, it achieves the buffer value. So, and a good example of a buffer value would be general welfare. There are so many different things that lead to general welfare, and so now my arguments can focus on different elements that lead to general welfare. A lot of people also use values like general welfare or quality of life to make it easier for them to win the values debate, because if their opponent brings up a value, they can just argue, my opponent's value is great, it's actually a part of my value of general welfare. So therefore general welfare is still the value we should use today. They're not necessarily advantageous. Sometimes it's better to have just a regular specific value, but they can also be good if you're trying to communicate a larger step of logic or some larger ideas. Now, the third form of value is what's known as an anti-value, and it's actually much more rare, and that's because it's really confusing. So think of it like this. It is a value that you apply to the resolution, and if your side achieves that value, then that means it's a bad thing. For example, my side is good because it does not achieve the value. You could see how the logic might work, but you can also see how the logic would be really confusing. So, for example, don't use an anti-value of death, or saying, well, whichever side creates more death is therefore bad. Just use the value of life. You know, whichever side achieves life is the side that should win your round. Things like that. So some debaters will try to use an anti-value, and I think they've been successful in the past. I've never seen one written. I've never come across one when I was a debater, but they are out there. And if you're the type of logician that can sway anyone with your arguments, then maybe this is the type of value for you. But for now, just focus on a regular value. There's not a need to confuse the judge even more, especially when you're dealing with community judges. I want to go back to the idea of measurement, because sometimes with a buffer value, for example, you won't actually know whether or not you've met that buffer value. And in this case, you'll use what's called a criterion. A criterion is a measure for the value, because if the value measures the resolution, it's the mechanism by which we know the resolution is true, then the criterion is the way that we know the value has been met. So because values are external, specific, and measurable, they show us that the resolution is true or false, but sometimes your value is a really big idea. It can be really broad, and you need to help the judge understand how we actually meet the value. This is where we have the criterion. It's the means by which we achieve the value. So, for example, if my value is general welfare, then I might say that the way we know we achieve a good, orderly society, a generally wealthy society, is if we have my criterion of economic growth. So if we achieve economic growth, then that automatically means we achieve general welfare, and that automatically means that the resolution is true. So for example, if you use a criterion, rather than your contentions being my side upholds the value, my opponent's side does not uphold the value, you'll structure them as my side upholds the criterion, my opponent's side does not uphold the criterion, with an impact at the bottom saying that my side upholds the value. So if your value is general welfare, contention 1, incrementalism, upholds the criterion of economic growth, and the impact is that incrementalism upholds general welfare. So basically, if economic growth is met, then we know general welfare is met, then we know the resolution is true. Now, in order to work, the criterion has to be narrower than the value. It can't be another buffer value. So if we have the value of general welfare and your criterion is quality of life, the way we know we have achieved general welfare is through quality of life. That doesn't make sense, because the criterion should answer the question, how do we know we've met, and not just extend the question, how do we know that we've met? I really like a quote from Travis Hirsch. He says, the whole purpose of a criterion is to make the value more accessible. So if your value is good, it's just a little inaccessible logically, then that's where you have a criterion. And of course, your criterion should also be external. Every weighing mechanism that you use in LD should be external. But this also means you don't necessarily always need a criterion. They could certainly be helpful, but they can also be a little extra confusing, because if you're dealing with someone who doesn't know LD framework very well, and you keep on adding these pieces of framework, the judge might have a harder time understanding why the criterion is there or what it actually is doing. And so if you don't need any extra logic to connect your value to your case, then you don't need a criterion. If you do need extra logic, if you're helping the judge set up a logical syllogism, a logical step, then you do need a criterion. So I recommend a criterion if you have a really specific case and you're trying to narrow it down as much as possible, because again, you're trying to be advantageous to your side to prove the resolution true. Use a criterion. If you're not trying to do that, if you have a lot simpler case and you're focusing a lot more on your evidence and your examples, then don't run a criterion, because it's precious time that you're taking away from your constructive. So with that, let's actually look at some different values that I've seen run and heard have been run at different tournaments, and look over them individually and see whether or not they would be good values. I don't necessarily know what the debaters meant by these particular values. I can only guess, but let's look at them one by one. So the first one we have is lasting liberty. And of course, they might say that liberty is freedom, and they've also put a little condition there. We're trying to achieve a specific type of liberty, one that is sustainable, one that lasts. Now, they might need a criterion to prove or to set up the foundation of how do we know when something lasts. For example, if they had just the value of liberty, well, that we know what liberty is, so we know when it has been met. But if you're giving an extra condition of lasting liberty, how do we know when something is lasting? What are the conditions that need to be met in order to consider something lasting? That's where we would have a criterion. A criterion would answer that question for us. Well, we know that if we achieve this, then liberty will last. Maybe we add a criterion to this value. Civil rights, human rights, those two things are, we know when they've been upheld. We can tell when they've been upheld. Human dignity is also really good. It could add a criterion. How do we know when humans have been dignified? But a lot of people already assume that we know what we mean when we talk about the dignity of humans, and usually it comes with things like rights or freedom, things like that. So don't necessarily need a criterion. You could certainly add one. Same for general welfare. Don't necessarily need a criterion if you just want to focus on a general idea of a society being improved. But if you wanted to narrow it down and make your case a little stronger, then you could have general welfare with a criterion of whatever direction that your case is trying to go. Another value I thought was interesting was the idea of virtue ethics with a criterion of respecting life. And this, basically what this is saying is, we need to respect life, and this is an ethical argument that we're trying to uphold, which is fine. But if your criterion is the idea of respecting life, we might make that the value. So the ultimate goal of today's round is the societal change should be in a way that respects human life. And I might even add a criterion to that. How do we know when life has been respected? Maybe we have a criterion of human rights. So we meet the standard of human rights. That leads us to the highest priority, which is the respecting life. Another way of saying respecting life is probably human dignity. So honestly, this person could have the value of just human dignity. Maybe human dignity with a criterion of human rights. We know that humans are dignified when their rights have been upheld. That's probably a much simpler way to put the argument that they're making here. If we look at the idea of justice, we have the idea of appropriate timing was their criterion. But how do we know when something is appropriate timing? Again, a criterion should never leave more questions than answers. So we might have the value of timing or something like that, and then the criterion of the measure by which we've achieved the appropriate timing. If their argument is trying to say that we need everything to be cohesive, maybe they have a value of cohesiveness with a criterion that supports the idea that society is moving in a way that helps it to grow. Maybe we have societal progress. That's another timing issue, progressing into something. So we could improve this with a value like that. We have a value of stability. This is, a good value. How do we determine what is stability? They might show that in their definitions. You might have a criterion that shows how do we know we have reached stability? But if they define it narrow enough, you might not need a criterion for that. And it doesn't look like they used a criterion for this either. Same thing with effectiveness, however. When we have a value of this thing is more effective, you have to ask the question, how do we know something is effective? That's where we would have a criterion. So maybe the criterion, or in terms of what makes effective social change, maybe we could use human rights, we could use economic prosperity, because Remember how I said values have a moral charge? Well, things like rights, dignity, liberty, ethics, justice, those all have a larger moral charge. Goodness, rights, dignity, freedom, those are good things. Effectiveness has a much lower moral charge. We're just trying to see what is more efficient, which is more effective. And so our criterion is going to be something more data related, something on that level of the moral charge. Same thing with sustainability. So what exactly do we mean by sustainability? How do we know when something is considered sustainable? I would also probably add a criterion here that answers that question. How do we know when something is stable? Unless, of course, they again define either effectiveness or stability in a way that is very narrow, because the definitions do matter. If we look down to the similarly structured values of persuasion and guidance, again, these are all affirmative values, by the way. They're trying to say that, which, maybe with persuasion and guidance is the idea of changing or controlling certain minds in order to make growth happen, for example. So how do we know persuasion has been met would probably be my question. And then how do we guide people? What exactly is the condition that we need to meet that will guide people to make the right decision? So we could add a criterion here, but we could also define it in a way that we don't need a criterion. And lastly, the value of social change. Now, this is a value that has been run in the past, and I could see the logic of where people are trying to go. Incrementalism is superior to radicalism because it changes society more. However, that's not external, right? Because the resolution is already incrementalism is superior to radicalism as a means to achieve social change. So we wouldn't say that it's superior because it changes society. This is where the value comes in, right? What part of society are we trying to change? How do we know society has changed? That's where we have the value. The value gets to determine what type of social change we want, and of course you're proving that the value has been met and answering the question, how do we know, or how does society change in that way? So do not run a value of social change, as it is circular logic. Incrementalism cannot be superior to radicalism as a means of achieving social change because it achieves social change. That doesn't make sense. What type of social change and how? The answer to those questions is where you get your value or possible criterion. The values debate is the most important part of Lincoln Douglas values debate. So understanding what makes a good value and how to write a good one is key. And I hope this video helped you in doing that. So stay tuned for the next Mars Hill Monday and the next Theory Thursday and whatever future projects I have for you, because we've got some really good and relevant content coming up. Thanks for watching this video. I will see you next week.